Um, Welcome to From the Heart. I'm Leanne, and today I have a guest, Katt Brooks, and the theme is grief. I think it's such an important topic just because of what we're seeing in the world and within ourselves, and how it can manifest into the world when we don't deal with what is on our heart or when it's grief. I have this quote here from Lee Nugan, and she says the transformational process of grief has the power to heal your mind and body, your heart and life, and also to help in the healing of the wounded heart in the world. And um, I'm seeing through myself and just through the lens of watching the world, what's going on right now. Um, that when we don't deal with our grief, it can turn to anger, which then turns to vengeance, and then to the wars and the genocide that we're seeing in our country and outside of our country. And so, I'm a big fan of just taking responsibility for what we put out there. And Katt has so much to offer. I hear the most amazing things about her, about grief and sitting with our grief, the process of grief. And so I really wanted to have her on the podcast. She came highly, highly recommended. Um, Katt, do you want to tell us about yourself and what your background is?
Yeah, of course. First of all, that quote gave me goosebumps because I feel like it actually really summarizes the work I do. I was like, oh, I can feel that in my whole body. So thank you for sharing that. It was beautiful. So I work as a holistic grief coach, and I have worked in private practice for the past 2.5 years as a holistic grief coach. But I have a long roster of experience for the past 15 years in grief, bereavement, palliative care, progression of illness, and what do I say about myself? Grief and bereavement and loss has just felt like this desire on my heart, or this universal call, since I remember when I was like 18 years old, just feeling this deep call into death work and grief work. And it's been beautiful to be in in an experience in life where I get to expand and grow and see different parts of myself grow in this work, while I share and learn from the clients that I work with. And I love what you spoke about in that quote, in that, like, I feel like the work that I do now as a holistic coach, I work in spirituality and emotional supporting, and in allowing human beings to come back to their bodies after grief. And even before that grief, sometimes people aren't in their bodies at all, right? And they don't trust their bodies. But I love now that I get to hold space to create safety for people to come back to their being and feel safe in themselves after grief experiences. And that's just my ultimate real goal in the work I do.
Oh, that's really beautiful. What you said makes me want to skip right to a question is what are the tools for yourself or for other people to better hold someone who is grieving, holding space for someone?
Yeah, that's a beautiful question. So I worked in a career for 13 years of my life where I was like a companion, and I worked side by side families whose children were dying. And I was almost in this job, you're almost a part of these families' lives, right? You grow attached, you love these children and stuff like that. And I can very much say that for much of my career, I did not hold space for myself properly, or I did not process things properly because I didn't think I deserved to feel the emotion. And there was no safe space for me to grieve because it didn't feel like my own. I didn't allow myself to accept it, right? So what I really teach to anyone who is supporting someone through something hard is valuing your own experience of emotion, right? Realizing that if you are holding deep space for somebody in grief, in trauma, in hard emotions, or even if you're doing a wellness practice where emotions are coming up, but not less necessarily words are coming out, giving yourself the compassion and understanding that you are being impacted, that that emotion is touching you and you deserve to process it, right? When we suppress and say it's not ours, it's actually pushing a piece of our work or our self away. So understanding it impacts you is like the biggest step, so that you can then take the awareness to pick tools or pick practices to hold better space for yourself in doing that, right?
That's really nice to hear, because we all take on, bits from the outside world, and we always are told to, it's not yours, and don't let it impact you and things like that. So that's really nice to just kind of give ourselves permission that we are impacted by the outside world, by someone that we love and their grief. And even if we don't know the person immensely, that if we're around that person, their grief will impact us. I wanted to also, in that, like, this discussion of holding space, there's a quote by Pema Chodron. I'm a big fan of quotes. It's she writes, "Compassion is not a relationship between the healer and the wounded. It's a relationship between equals. Only when we know our own darkness well can we be present in the darkness of others. Compassion becomes real when we recognize our shared humanity."
I love that it talks about the word compassion versus empathy. I think it's really important for us to define the difference between those two energies, right? Empathy is us when we're supporting someone. If I was supporting you, going down, like say you're down here and you're really emotional, and I decide that I need to go as low as you to be with you at this same spot in my own emotion too. So say you're disclosing something really emotional, and I'm like, oh, I'm going to go into my life, into my trauma, into my grief, to bring myself down to you, to compare, to be the same, and to be with you there. That's actually not supportive for that person, because you don't need me to be emotional. You don't need me to be hurt. You need me to be sturdy, right? It actually is really detrimental for me, because I didn't need to bring up my grief. I didn't need to go into something from my past in that moment that could actually hurt me. Compassion is being at a supportive level to see someone and bear witness to them and hold them in security, not bringing up your own stuff, and being able to just witness you and what you need from a grounded and stable space. So I just love that quote, because it is like so important for us to acknowledge compassion is me showing up as me to hold you in sturdiness and groundedness, for you to bring up what you need, because it's not about me in that moment. It's about you being able to express all those things, right?
Yeah, those are good reminders. I would like to talk about the grief cycle, and like, how does that show up for people, and what can help in the different stages of the grief cycle.
Yeah. Well, the first lesson of all is there's no specific stages in grief.
Mm.
There's a big myth in our world that we go through. It's like denial, accept, I don't know, like resentment, all of these different things. And it's in this like linear motion. A big stigma we have in this world is that it's in this sequential order, but it's actually not. Grief is the most huge roller coaster with twists and turns all over the place. And one day or one moment, we may be in denial, and 2 seconds later, we may be in acceptance, but then we'll go right back into something else, right? So understanding that there's no right or wrong place to be, that grief is so individual, that every emotion is okay, and more than one emotion can happen at once, right? And that's one of the biggest lessons I actually teach my clients, because so many people will come and say, oh, like, I'm, am I grieving wrong because I'm feeling this way? Or am I grieving wrong because I'm back to where I felt like I was 2 years ago? And the answer is no, right? There's no right or wrong way for us to grieve. There's only your way. And grief comes in waves and bursts that puts us sometimes in phases or in emotional states that feel like what we were before. But the most important part is for us to realize all emotions are okay,
Mm.
and knowing that as we move through our grief, like we probably have different tools or different ways of being with our grief compared to that first time we felt it, you know?
Right. Mm. And
There's a beautiful model actually
mm,
that I is my favorite model to explain about grief, and it's like these pictures of these like black dots in a jar, and it says, society thinks that grief gets smaller as time goes by. And then there's 3 at the bottom that are like, but in reality, grief stays the exact same size, but we just start to grow around it. And then you have stuff growing around it. But like, yeah, our grief doesn't shrink. It doesn't go away. It doesn't stop being there, because we would never want our loved one to disappear. We would never want our bond to disappear. Or even if it's a different type of grief, we learn, we grow, we develop because of that grief experience, right? And it's more acknowledging that it's always there, but we grow and have different tools to be with our grief differently as time goes by.
mm. Our container grows for it.
Mhm.
Yeah. Nice. Um, I was reading a book that I recommend to anyone. It's really easy to read. It's called The Song and the Transformational Power of Grief by Lee Nugan, the one that I was quoting. And she really talks about forgiveness. And I think that that's so important to talk about. Forgiveness as an act of liberation, not forgiveness as an act of I'm going to do nothing and I'm going to be submissive, because people sometimes think forgiveness is just letting things go. It can be. But do you have anything to say about forgiveness or practice you'd like to share for forgiveness? Because I think it's so important for me. I don't have a ton of grief around losing people in my life so far. But just in like leaving my job, I've had to develop a stronger practice of forgiveness. So, and do you have anything to say about forgiveness? Yeah.
Yeah. Forgiveness is a very like loaded word, I think, in our society. And I think we also really think that forgiveness typically is us giving something to the person that hurt us, or giving something to that thing in our life. You know, it's like, if I forgive you, I'm giving up all of this stuff within myself, or I'm giving it back to you, meaning it doesn't matter, you know? And what really comes up for me when I think about forgiveness is more actually forgiveness is a releasing within us, right? Often that person, sometimes these relationships, we don't even have that person who hurt us in our lives, or there's no way that that conversation could ever happen, right? But forgiveness also often is a release within us of what that person is holding on in us, you know, or what that situation is holding on in us, like the consumption of thoughts and worries and negative thought patterns that are just consuming us all the time, have such a weight on ourselves, right? And sometimes the forgiveness is us releasing those things so it's not controlling us anymore. It's more us taking back our power in our life to be able to not have these like consuming negative things take us over. And it's not giving them power. It's not saying it's okay. It's us taking back our life often. And the other thing is, forgiveness isn't a one-time thing. Often we think, okay, I'm going to forgive this person or this situation or myself, and it's going to be like a one-time thing. The reality is often we have to come back to that thought of forgiveness many times, right? Or maybe new things pop up in our mind of things that are to do with that situation, and it has to be forgiven, right? And it's not just a one-time fix, right? Forgiveness is an act of doing something and noticing and witnessing like frequently.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. That resonates a lot. Do you have tools at all for forgiveness?
I think the biggest tools, like it's interesting because people ask me like, what are the specific tools, the things I can do? I always say awareness work is the biggest tool, right? Which is a daily act or a daily practice of knowing, right? If we are knowing the consumption that something is having or the weight that is having on us through awareness, the hold that the lack of forgiveness is holding on us, to cause us to feel disconnected from our bodies, to feel like we are always consumed with these thought patterns, when we feel like it's controlling us, when we see that it's controlling us versus helping us, that can only be done through awareness work, right?
Yeah.
And we can only start to shift the energy of it through awareness work too, like shifting the lens of how we see situations in our life from conditioning, like deep conditioning that's moving through us, that's skewing all these things happening in our life, to coming back to being and seeing for what's in front of us in the moment and what are moments in that we can take our power back. So yeah, it's not like a sit and do this every single day, or do this one practice and it will fix it, right? It's about how can you bring awareness to your life more, which is actually all of the work that I do with my clients, is like, how can we be aware about what is moving through your mind, moving through your body, to see life as it is right now with more clarity, rather than from the scope of your unconscious mind taking over and skewing it. So that's a loaded answer, I realize, but I would say my biggest tool is like, how can you as a human being, people who are listening as a human being, like use awareness to really see how things are impacting them in their thought patterns, and how can you come back to states of being, to come back into your power, to support your best life.
Right. To choose differently.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mm. Um, and then the other thing is that I wanted to bring up was just what are ideas that you would have in creating a community or a culture that would better integrate grief rather than like the shame and suppressing of grief that we have now. We see more now.
Mhm. Very loaded question. Um, I think the most important part to start with is the acknowledgement of what grief is. Many of us feel like the label of grief is only for someone who has had someone die in their life.
Mm.
So really understanding that grief in its definition is like all the emotions, the experiences, the physical symptoms, all these different things we experience after a loss, a significant loss in our life. And that can be anything, like what you're saying, the loss of your job, the loss of identity, the loss of finances, relationships, ability, like if someone gets sick, right? There's so many experiences of loss in our life, and we don't acknowledge that. Um, we all have grief, tons of it, right? And the more and more we can identify what grief is in our life, the more and more we can support ourselves and support the human beings around us. So I would, say that overarching acceptance that we all grieve, and how can we support each other through that and be okay with vulnerability. And then I'll just define bereavement, which is like, so there's the term grief, so we can understand that that's something we all experience. And bereavement is the emotional experience we have after someone has died. So being able to like really see those two labels. But I think it's advocacy, it's like, how can we teach more that we are all going through this, that we are all having some sort of grief in our life? How can it be more of a common thread in our conversations, in what we're moving through? How can we teach our children instead of hiding them from difficult emotions? How can we be okay with vulnerability? And I always think of Brene Brown. She has such amazing work about vulnerability, right? People feel a sense of deep belonging and connection when they have been able to be vulnerable with people. So grief is the biggest vulnerability. And if we can be together in it, which is really hard again, because we're so conditioned to not want to or to be afraid of being with someone with a big emotion. But the connection we can make from that are huge.
Mm. That hits home because I see myself having such a hard time with vulnerability, especially grief. I'd rather I have like a shell of anger before the grief shows up, and I'd rather be alone in that grief, um, rather than to show it to the world or anyone.
Which I do believe is like it's normal, right, to want to be isolated in it, because in certain parts within our grief journey, the triggers are so big, right, that nothing anyone can say around you or do is going to help, right? Because it's not going to fix, like, you can't fix grief. It's the one thing in life you can't fix. And sometimes in the very beginning of after a grief experience, we do isolate because the triggers feel so big and so consuming that anything someone does or doesn't do, or how they touch us or breathe around us, just feels like too much. We have to actually do enough work within ourselves, or be with ourselves in it enough to have enough confidence first to go out that we can be us with this grief, and not have anger masking it when we go somewhere, not have resentment masking it. We can just come in our state of being. But grief has a way of like literally shifting every part of your being, that you're like, who am I now with this giant grief? Like, who are you now without this career that was identifying you, right? Like, when every person around you probably is like, hey, what are you doing with your life? How's work? Like, that's probably so difficult for you. And like, so who are we, right? And it's
Yeah, it's the boundaries. I don't even know how to answer that question. What do you do
yeah,
with your life?
but it's
Living. Yeah.
but we also like that, and that is like a sturdiness, right? Or that's like a confidence in yourself. Like, why do I have to identify myself as my career? You don't, right? You are a human being with a beautiful essence who gets to be you, and it doesn't have to be because of this job. But there's a certain emotional unpacking that you can get to, that when that question gets asked to you, that you can answer and be like, oh no, I can be so in my body right now and answer this and it not feel like it's like firing up my nervous system,
Right. Mhm. Yeah. Yeah,
Mm.
thank you. Um, so, those were the topics I had in mind. Um, is there anything that you wanna add? Anything that, like, you're inspired to share with us?
Mm. Yeah, probably lots. Um, yeah, I would be, yeah, well, I think one of the biggest acknowledgments that's important within grief experiences is to come to an understanding and knowing of how of it, right? Like, so often in our life, we are not having safe spaces to feel big emotions, to talk about big emotions and express them. And so often when we're moving through any type of grief, it can feel so ambiguous and huge and like almost up to your eyeballs of emotion, because it doesn't actually feel like there's a safe space to express it, to talk about it, to be with it, right? So the biggest tip I could give for anyone who is grieving is start to actually cultivate or create safe spaces for yourself to be with your grief. Because when we're in a society, like you're saying, who is grief phobic or um, difficult emotions are really hard for our society to be with, it can just feel like super disenfranchised for you to be in your life. It's like, well, I can't be anywhere with this, but it feels so consuming, and it feels like it's going to come out, and it will come out at inopportune moments for people, right? Where it explodes out in a situation versus, and it feels too much and too overwhelming versus if we cultivate safe spaces, we can actually teach our nervous system that there are certain places that are actually safe for me to have my emotions. If I pick one time in my week where I am like intentionally journaling about my grief, or I am choosing to be with it or like bring it up, we start to actually retrain your nervous system that it's like, wait a minute, okay, I actually have safe spaces for emotions to come out because I've built this into my life, or I've built it with this human being, or built this with this support worker or this friends. And then it starts to regulate your system more, that it doesn't feel like grief is always everywhere and always consuming. It starts to regulate it down, that you start to feel more I don't want to say in control of your grief, because that's not the word I want to say, but you feel like your grief is more manageable, or it just feels like it is more safe, right?
Mm-hmm.
When it is so conditioned to not feel safe. Um, so yeah, that's my ultimate biggest tip I tell people is like, if you are feeling like you're feeling ruled by your grief, you feel like it's everywhere you go, it feels like you can cry at any moment, build sacred times to connect with your emotions in your week and see how that impacts you, whether it's by yourself or with someone.
Mm. Yeah. Um, yeah, that's a good tool. um, and then, so where can people find you if they wanted to book something with you, or just follow you, or anything like that?
Yeah. So my Instagram page is at cat.holisticgrief. So you can find me there and reach out to me there. I'm on Facebook at Katt Brooks, and you can reach out to me there. I also have a website that's www.holisticgriefcoaching.com. So always when I'm working with new clients or connecting with new people, I always do a complimentary first call, because it's super, super important for me to have a client feel deeply resonant with me, feel like I am the right person to hold them in their emotions, in their experience. So I always do a first call. So if anyone is ever interested, that is always something where it's actually a session. It's not me trying to sell you. It's not me telling you about my work or anything. It's actually me getting to know you, allowing you to express, and seeing if that's the work that needs to be done within you or supported in you. So for anyone who is interested, know that's always like available for them to see. I also know lots of grief resources in the Ottawa area as well too. So
Oh, great. Awesome. Thank you so much. Um, I'm sure that when I'll re-listen to this, I'll there'll be a lot more things like kind of dinging in my head again and hitting my heart. So I'm really happy that you were on my podcast. I feel like it goes well with a lot of the things that I speak about, because there's been a lot of loss just in the last few years. With all kinds of things, or even our change of perception of the world, like not even the people that we're losing, or that we have lost. And so, yeah, I think,
in the sense of safety, just like grief is in our sense of safety is of living, in the past couple of years too, right?
yeah, yeah. And then I just have another little quote, and it says, "To choose to act out of love from the most painful places is miraculous." It's just something that makes me remember. Yeah.
Totally. I'll just say too, one of the one epiphany that each and every one of my clients goes through in their journey in grief, of all the different types of grief that they're experiencing, is they often get to a standpoint of understanding that grief experience, however terrible, however heartbreaking, however much they want that thing or that person back, has also been a catalyst for them to find themselves deeply, for them to come to a standpoint of like, yeah, breaking open their heart and actually feeling so solid and secure in themselves that it's dualistic, right? Like grief is such a dualistic experience in our life where it's the most painful, shattering experience that we feel like we're going through, but also huge moments of clarity, because it's like, if I witness, in losing this person who is so important to me, I witness that I'm not sacrificing my happiness anymore. I'm not sacrificing, not doing the things that I want because of them, because I have gone through this pain. Now I know that I will be like taking care of myself. I'll be doing the things I need to feel more embodied in myself.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, it would bring a lot of change. It does bring a lot of change. Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much to you, and to the listener as well. I hope we all have a good day.
Thank
Yeah.
you.